Welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earthkeepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. Hey, Earthkeepers. In recent past episodes, you might recall hearing the term edgewalkers. And by that term, we mean those of us who have moved away from the center of conventional church and faith praxis and moved toward the creative edges of the institution, where new imaginings and alternate expressions of faith life are being explored. That includes, of course, new ways of thinking about and experiencing God in and through creation. In our interview with John Phillip Newell earlier in the season, he described that mode as dwelling in the space between temple and wilderness. In this episode, I'll be talking with a good friend and fellow edgewalker, Victoria Loorz, co-founder of the Wild Church movement and current director of the Center for Wild Spirituality, or Seminary of the Wild as it's known. In this, which is part one of our conversation, we explore the idea of what it means to practice prophetic critique of the mainstream church while still loving the church and seeking to be part of its reformation and renewal. Here then is the first part of that conversation. Victoria, welcome to the podcast again. I have to say that you are one of my favorite people to talk to on the podcast.
Yay, that is a privilege.
You rank up there.
When somebody asks me, you're doing a podcast today? You don't have time. I'm like, yeah, but it's Forrest.
Yeah, right.
He's my friend.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I always know that on some fundamental level, I'll be challenged. And as you know, I've reached out to you because I think you have a lot of wisdom in the area of creation-centered faith practice, which honestly, a lot of Earthkeepers podcast listeners are really hungry for. Ideas are one thing, but what to do with those ideas is another. And I know that you've done a lot of experimentation, a lot of teaching as well. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing some of your wisdom and being challenged by your perspective.
Yay,
but
happy to be here with you.
Let me ask you first, just catch us up from the last time. What are you up to these days?
What I'm mostly up to, just personally, is my mother is in those last phases, the last phase of life. And so I moved here a year ago to Virginia to basically rent a house with her and be with her. And it shifted from sort of just co-living together into caregiving in May. And so it's been a immersion into what that looks like when you're not living as a village. I'm the single one of the siblings, and so it makes sense, but it's also just much more consuming than I imagined. Mm-hmm. So, but on the work aspect, the Center for Wild Spirituality have added a second year to our Seminary of the Wild program. And, the first year is all really what you just said, practices and experiments and living into what it means to be in sacred relationship with this world. And at the core of that is a worldview shift that I hope we talk about sometime today. But the second year is then, now what do I do about that? How do I support others? I call it midwiving a new story or a new stories into our culture. We really are transitioning from a series of old stories of dominance of individualism, of consumerism, of these kinds of stories that have identified us as Western humans, as me. That's who I am. That's who we are. That's what worldview is, as you teach about. It's just the things you don't question, but we're questioning. The generations alive now, at least those of us who I call the edgewalkers, like you, like probably every one of your listeners, we are the edgewalkers who are asking those questions on the edge and who are sensing new stories that are emerging. Sensing a new way of looking at the world and a new way of being in relationship with the world, which is a sacred privilege. So how we do that, what does that look like? How do we support others in this time of a lot of unraveling, ecological unraveling, political unraveling, social, educational, like in pretty much every institutional world, including the church? There's a lot of unraveling that we can talk about, but what do we do about it? What does it look like to start to build a new way? And how can we be midwives of a new way of being in our particular context? So that's what our second year is about. We call it Eco Spiritual Direction Certification, or just a word I made up, Wild Guide Certification, so that can apply to any, whether you're working in an institution, a church, your own business, something you want to do on the side or at the center, but it's basically more vocational focused. We just launched that this month.
Yeah. I'm guessing that the people who come for these programs are looking for people of like heart and mind that probably maybe even have been struggling on their own, feeling alone in that edge walking. But it sounds like you're providing some kind of venue for community and common thinking and exchange, which probably is very life-giving for folks like that.
Totally. And in fact, something we've talked about before is how as more and more people are leaving the church or not feeling comfortable within the church, it leaves a huge gap. There aren't a lot of other venues or ways that we can enter into those sacred conversations with one another and have that deep community outside of the church. It's one of the main things about church, that then people feel that gap. And so there's a deep longing for connection and for a place they can be fully themselves, and acknowledging that their sense of the sacred in and between all things that they experience profoundly in nature that wasn't really necessarily accepted within their churches, and yet also can understand their deep spirituality that is related to their spiritual tradition, which for me is Christianity, like you, without having to leave the church altogether or without having to cut off their core part of what they've experienced as their spiritual lives. So I think that community makes sense. I think that's probably what's been happening in Circlewood as well. How have you experienced that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I'm taking all kinds of notes right now, but I do want to, I think, have another conversation at some point about the wild guides, because my colleague James and I have been asking that question. If we're seeking to transform every aspect of faith, we call it greening everything. Spiritual direction is one of those topics that have come up, right? How do we step beyond the boundaries of the status quo and the sort of historical understandings of what guidance is of that sort? And how do we challenge it in helpful ways and creative ways? How do we find new forms and take risks? I mean, edge walking is such a great term, because I think it's being on the edge that allows you to look back into the center to see what is, but then to look out into the future to see what could be. And, well, it's a beautiful image. I mean, whenever you say edgewalker, I imagine a great circle, right? And you walking along the edge of it. But I would say that sometimes I make the mistake, and maybe we in Circlewood make the error of assuming that everyone wants to be an edgewalker, because, that is a scary place. You could fall off the edge. At least that's the fear. And so I think in Circlewood, we're asking that question is, how do we help people to understand that risk-taking toward creativity, especially in terms of faith practice, is okay? Not just okay, it's a good and necessary thing for the future of the church and for future generations in faith practice. So I think those are the hard questions that we're grappling with too, probably in common with you. So yeah, I mean, that's why I love talking to you, is I feel like we're asking so many of the same questions and we each get different angles on the answer. So it's always helpful.
That's the cool thing. When I first started Church of the Wild, when I started meeting others, doing the same things, asking the same questions, even in the same ways, even though we had totally different mentors and people that we're connected with, it made us realize, and it's applied to you and to many others in this space, this is something bigger than us. We're participating in something bigger, and we are responding to this call of what I call the call of the sacred wild. It's that wild edge. It's where the holiness is. It's that moment of like, I didn't realize it, but heaven and earth are actually connected. I didn't realize that this ground is holy. That walking along the edge thing one of the things I've thought about in the past couple of years is that it's not just tiptoeing on the edge like you're about to fall off one side or the other, but it's more like amoeba-like or organic. And I feel like those of us who are called to this edge, and you're right, some people aren't called there. Some people are called in different places. And I think it's just owning that there is an amount of risk involved. There is a bit of a, if I could use the word prophetic role of looking into the unseen, what is not manifested yet. But it's picturing it in this more sort of like organic, like a jellyfish, in that the more we are able to stretch ourselves as we're sort of, I picture us hand in hand, arm in arm, looking outward, and some of us looking inward. But the more we can stretch ourselves and take those steps, it expands the whole in a way, it expands the whole in ways that we can't really put on our annual reports. In ways that we can't really measure, but it's still happening. And you see it in these indirect ways that are just fascinating to kind of experience, but we can't hone it all down and try to put it all into quantify it, but it's still real. And I experience the edge as if I picture it as a circle as well. And it's sort of like if Christianity were this circle, which of course it's not, and it had edges, which it kind of does, but I'm not sure it should. And those are the very center, are very fundamentalists, like the ones who are like needing to keep things the same. And then there's all these gradations. And then there's a bunch of us on the edges who are sort of feeling on the inside edge. We have no compunction to really leave, but can't really move back into the center again. Mm-hmm. And that's not where we belong. And what was fascinating to me when I started the Center for Wild Spirituality or Seminary for the Wild is that even though we had created it, we thought for pastors who are feeling that inside edginess and wanting to bring their congregations deeper. What happened, who showed up, was 40 to 60% people that weren't in the Christ tradition at all. And I think you've probably experienced that as well. And so, but they're being drawn to the edge. They're like, really? I'm going to reconnect with Christianity? And we all talk about it. It's like, yes, but I think something new is emerging. I know this is what you and James are exploring. Something new is emerging that is not disconnected from these roots. But it's also not just a simple reformation of reforming rearranging the furniture and bringing in pianos. It's not at that level either. It's something new is emerging within an ongoing story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Something you said struck me that some people are not, in fact, called to be edgewalkers. Some people maybe are looking inward. Perhaps they see part of their responsibility is to hold the standards, to hold the line.
They're needed as well.
They are needed. But you know who maybe I feel like I need to speak to sometimes? If you're not one of those edgewalkers, I think it doesn't become then your responsibility to oppose the edgewalkers. Because there's so much resistance right now from the center that it's hard, I think, for some people to be creative and take risks and find new forms and bring faith practice into relevance. That I think it's just hard for people, harder than it needs to be because of opposition, right?
From the same side we're on. It's just not yet.
Exactly. Right. And I think what's behind it is fear. I mean, you could also call it defend it as love for the church. I want to stand for what's true and right and good. But that often means a sort of rigidity that doesn't allow for creativity. And I think it's the fear that gets in the way that's underneath that impulse. Yeah. So what do you do with people who are basically the ones who, out of fear, are standing against any possibility of new thinking, of new ways of encountering God, new ways of living in this world in ways that are relevant, morally relevant, ethically relevant?
I think that's true not only in the church. I think that's what our whole culture is facing right now. There's an organization out of UC Berkeley that John Powell is the head of now. I don't know if he started it, but it's called Belonging Without Othering. It's mostly focused on racial conflict and whatnot, but I think it's applicable to our work as well, and it's applicable within the church. It's like, how do we continue to belong to one another? How do we continue to belong to the planet, to one another in a bigger sense, without having to elevate myself and therefore diminish others? And I think that's just so foundational that whether it's white supremacy, patriarchy, species supremacy, where only humans matter, and so we don't even think twice about decimating a forest. It's that caste system that humans can tend to do, but don't have to do. And that feels like so foundational. And so I think that it's built out of fear. It's built out of a sense of scarcity, that there's only enough resources. There's only enough love. There's only enough money for me. There's not enough money for you. And you're different enough. I'm going to other you. I think it's just so foundational. And it's one of the curiosities I have just personally. I just read Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent. She's talking about that, again, racially, but it's just so foundational. And I just keep thinking, is this part of being human? Do we have to have this? And we just had Four Arrows. He's a Cheyenne, indigenous Irish man who writes a lot about worldview and the indigenous worldview. And we just had him on this Wednesday in Seminary, the Wild, our podcast. And he was talking about, no, humans haven't always been this way. Even Dermot O'Murchu, a theologian out of Ireland, he talks about out of the millions of years that humans have been around, evolving, it's only in the last 10,000 so years that humans have started to do this kind of hierarchical empire building way of being. And you know this more than anybody. And so we have it deep in our DNA that it doesn't have to be this way. And that's what gives me hope, even though it just seems to keep happening throughout history. There is this edge-walking way. I think Jesus is an edge-walker. Are you kidding? This is the edge-walking way of sort of fundamental to being within the Christ tradition, that we are going to be exploring how to live within this context in a way that is true to love, that is true to the way that Jesus talked about what it means to be human. And that is a big story. And so I feel like we're not just trying to adopt an indigenous worldview. We're intending to remember what is indigenous to us as humans, as earth dwellers. And so it is Christian, but it's bigger than that.
Yeah. I teach a lot of students, graduate students who intend to go serve in many places in the world doing nonprofit work. And of course, I have to do a lot of teaching about culture. And one of the core concepts that we talk about is ethnocentrism, which, if anyone knows the word, they often hear about it as a negative word. If you're ethnocentric, you're narrow-minded, you're blinded by culture, you don't value the other. But in fact, ethnocentrism is a neutral word. In fact, it describes a trait, a human trait that, as you put it, is in our DNA. Because to have culture, there have to be boundaries. To have culture, there have to be definitions of this is what we believe, this is where we stand, this is how we eat, this is what we eat, right? I mean, that is culture. And without those boundaries, it's
identity, it's belonging.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. So what we talk about in class is the goal is to not let yourself be controlled by ethnocentric impulses. And that's, I think, what you're saying in a different way. Yes, it's inherent in us to want to know what the boundaries are, but that doesn't mean then we need to reject those who are outside the boundaries. Instead, it's a matter of learning how to listen, but even more importantly, understanding that your culture is a construct. It isn't the definition of right and wrong. And you have to understand that it's possible that you might actually learn something about right and wrong, good or bad, by listening to others outside of the culture circle. And that is really hard to do. I think it takes discipline because it goes against human nature, right? And it requires humility.
It's a spiritual practice.
It is. I think your mention of that word love is key. Love is the key practice behind not being mastered by ethnocentrism, because you have to look at the other with generosity and without judgment that they are simply wrong by dint of the fact that they are outside of your circle. And that is so hard, but when it happens, it is so powerful.
And that's even true with the relationship with the natural world. And so that's really the core of our programs, of the Wild Church movement in general, is restoring, well, just to use our sort of motto is restoring sacred relationship with all that is. And those are little practices of relationshiping, of the practice of love. It's like in my book, Church of the Wild, the real center of it is that aha that I talked about before on your podcast, that even within the Christian core scriptures is an understanding that we are in relationship with all that is. We are in relationship with, I'm just going to say it, with the wild, that Jesus went to pray every time to be into relationship with the wilderness, with the lake, with the garden. And so there's something fundamental about that relationality. And I think that's what's different for us. For what does it mean, wild spirituality? What do I mean by that? It's that the wildness is really like not just out of control, as it can be understood, but really as it was meant to be. It's like your essence, your wild self is who you're meant to be, who you're created to be. And we are all created to be in an ecosystem. We're all created to be in deep relationship, not just physical relationship, where I can take the tomatoes from my garden or I can take the oxygen from the tree, but that I am in relationship to give back. And it's not just physical, because physical and emotional and spiritual are just constructs of trying to understand the wholeness of what it means to be alive. And so we're also in emotional relationship with the trees and the animals around us. We're also in a spiritual relationship. And the relationship between that is the presence of the holy, that acting in love and not just talking about it, like you had mentioned early on. Like, it's the acting in love. How do we act? How do we remember how to do this? Because it's in our DNA. We know how to do this. We know how to love. That's how we're created. But we forget through societal, through cultural, through agendas of empire, through survival of just what it takes to not be othered, to fit in. All kinds of stories, but it's generational. It's been around a long time, this disconnection from one another, from our own core self, from God. It's also kind of cyclical. It's kind of like the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus isn't just a religious concept. It's the way life works. The way a forest works. It's the way those seasons work. It's the way we work on a lifetime and on a daily scale, that to open up to something new, something old just dies. That's the way it works. And so, like, really living into that.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that, because what caught my attention was that concept of othering the wild, othering nature. And ironically, the church has in great part been responsible for teaching us that we are separate, that we even ought to be suspicious, right, of nature. And so now, as God is revealed in nature, that is shut off for so many people because they have been taught to mistrust, right? Instead, there's a bibliolatry almost that puts all the weight of truth on the Bible. And that can lead to a real imbalance, because those of us who have experienced it, and I think that there are a lot of people who have, understand that God is present in trees and rocks and wind, and of course even in people as part of creation. But if we open ourselves to that revelation, gosh, that means revelation is all around us. And how could we not live lives of awareness of God's presence and maybe constant worship? I mean, I know that sounds really idealistic, but I think we have been shut off. That's my point. Our teachings, our culture, for many of us, has drawn the line against the wild.
It's just so built into our language. It's built into our stories. It's built in, but it's like what I feel where I'm oriented is to dig beneath that and see what's at the core of this, what's at the roots. And so it's not just, I like that bibliolatry. It's not just fully, we believe every sentence, every word in this particular book, which doesn't even make sense, isn't even possible. It's not throwing it all away, though. To me, it's like, how do we dig beneath the ways that they've been culturally interpreted and culturally used, in some cases, in some generations, as very much a manipulative force. And so I'm really committed to, there is something new emerging. The Seminary of the Wild, I hold space for everybody, no matter where they're coming from, that wisdom, the fact that they feel drawn to be some kind of agent of reconnection with the rest of the natural world as something sacred, however you define that. So I don't talk about you need to leave Christianity, you need to come back to Christianity, you need to change Christianity. It's not about that. It's about being authentic with your life and how you're going to live into this. It's like these concepts are not new. They've been around on the edge the whole time. St. Francis and others. Thomas Berry 50 years ago was saying, we have tragically disconnected with the natural world. We don't know how to listen anymore to the wind and the trees like you were talking about. And until we learn how to do that, we're not going to be able to move forward. And it's not just about Christianity. It's about the whole culture. And we know, for example, that the climate crisis is at the core a spiritual problem. Even the scientists say that and know that. And yet the church isn't stepping into the church's role, into her role of spiritually, I want to say guiding, but even just holding people as we deal with these underlying spiritual traps that have led us to this deep disconnection. And there's such an amazing role that the church can play, whether it's the institutional church or those of us feeling on the edges, experimenting with new ways to be the church. It's really urgent right now.
As you speak, I'm thinking back to an interview I did with Hannah Malcolm, and she just sort of offhandedly talked about some of the things that the historical churches in the UK are doing about climate change. And she noted that during some days of heat wave, the churches, some of them open their doors for people to come in and just stay there until the worst of the heat had gone. And these churches are giant old stone constructs that stay cool all the time. And so they were inviting people in, regardless of their beliefs, of their ethnicity, just saying, come and find shelter here. That just struck me as such a powerful symbol of what the church could be doing, right? We could be, at the very least, offering mercy in this time of crisis as things become worse, offering shelter. I do agree that I would love to see us also offering wisdom and guidance for how do we live in the midst of these changing circumstances. But it seems like at the very minimum, we need to be holding people in these difficult times, which are only going to be getting more difficult.
Exactly. And to expand our understanding of that responsibility or privilege of coming alongside people and expanding the idea of people. One of the things I loved is when I came to Circlewood once and we made these little sweet shelters for the little beings, the little mice and whatever to live in. Like that's just such an act of kindness, of restorative kindness. It's not about people. It's about people, but it's about mice people and little lizard people. And so I think expanding this sense of beloved community. I love something that Richard Rohr said once. How we regard this stone is how we regard all things. And I sort of poetically loved that, but it's not until I started really deepening into this, I want to say work, that's not even it, this way of being in intimate relationship with even all the more than human others, as well as the human others, that I got it. It's like, we can't other the forest and only see them as lumber. And at the same time, think that we're going to be racial reconciliators. It doesn't work that way. I remember when, this is a terrible example, but I'm going to use it anyway. When I was going through a difficult time in my divorce, I realized that I was cutting myself off from my husband. I was cutting my love off for him. And I realized you can't just cut off part of your heart. I was also cutting off some part of love for my children. I was also cutting off some part of love for God and myself. Like they're all interconnected. And it doesn't mean necessarily that I needed to be married forever in that situation. It does mean, though, how I regard others, even somebody I'm in conflict with, even somebody even a stone that I don't understand how a stone thinks or whatever. It's still a reverent regard for the other. That the other has, that this blue jay that just flew by my window, they have a sacred purpose for being here. They have things that are important to them. And how do I be in relationship with them? Or a tree has its own relationships, its own reason for being, but then needs to be cut down because it's about to fall in my house. There's a way to do that that's relationally, has relational integrity. There's a way to eat. Every single day, we need to eat something, which means some other live being needs to die for me to stay alive. It's the Pascal mystery built into everything. So it's not simple and la la land. Like all of wilderness is great. Wilderness is also terrifying. Predation is also dangerous. Earthquakes and volcanoes destroy a lot of life. And so that whole thing is part of aliveness. That whole thing is part of who God is and part of the presence of God and part of the relationship with God and all that is, including ourselves.
When you say things like that we need to redefine our relationship to a stone, I think that is a point where I know that many listeners hear that and say, I cannot go there. I do not know what you are talking about. And the impulse might be to dismiss it as la la land, as just crazy theology. But my challenge for all of those people who are feeling that right now is just stay open. Don't close off. Stay open to possibility. The fact is that if you're a Christ follower and that's the source of your feeling of defense, well, know that Victoria and I love Jesus deeply. And our lives are devoted to worship and reflecting him in the world. So that's our common ground. So my hope is that more and more people will be willing to stay in those places of discomfort long enough to actually give this a chance. Not that you and I are like pros at this. Like edgewalking is uncomfortable. That's the definition of edgewalking. But I think... I just think for those folks for whom this is a new idea, and just to use your phrase, I'm going to call it wild spirituality, I just would say stay open to learning. And here's why. My theory is that we know that, at least in a North American context, there are people who will call themselves followers of Christ who maybe have a strained or ambivalent relationship with the church. They may have been in the church all their lives, but suddenly something is not right. It's not a good fit. Something is wrong, and we don't always know what that is. Others, especially younger generations, never got it in the first place. They may look at their parents' generation and how they engage with Christian religion and just don't see anything in that for them. I guess my hope is that when we talk about these ideas, that some of these things, some of these new ways of reconceiving faith and faith practice could be an answer to that. And maybe that's my question for you. Is wild spirituality a corrective to something that's gone maybe fundamentally awry, but is yet correctable? What's your thought on that?
Well, I think it is. I kind of have a whole few chapters in my last book, and I'll be writing about it more in the next one, about how I mentioned that Jesus, every time he prayed, went into the wild. You know, the word there is he went into, which is a relational word. That relationality is the difference. This is the piece that I'm feeling needs to be brought back. And so it's not something new that we're wanting to bring in a new direction. And yet it is. It's something that is emerging, that is reconnecting with an origin, with something that is foundational, which is essentially love. The core of love your neighbor as yourself. Who is your neighbor? Just expanding that. Who is your neighbor? Who is your neighbor? Who is your neighbor? So it's, in one way, it's nothing new. In another way, it's like as you practice that, the way you live your life, the way civilization works, the way we're going to carve and create culture and then for the next generations is absolutely grounded in your core worldview, which is carved by your faith, which is carved by the way we understand those things that we hold most dear. And so I think that one of the ways that I've talked about wild spirituality is 35 years ago, I was involved with World Vision, and I worked on helping the evangelical church see how their own theology, our own ways of approaching our own scriptures, bring us from this dominance worldview into a stewardship worldview, that we have responsibility in our relationship with caring for other people, caring for the poor, caring for all of creation. And what I feel wild spirituality is going the next step, which is moving from stewardship, which kind of is inherently saying that we are the ones who know how to care for you. So we're going to tell you this little forest, this little area, how it's going to be versus being in where it's going, which is in relationship. I think wild spirituality is all about relationship. It's restoring relationship. And so that's the piece that I think is restoring what is foundational to the Christ tradition, what is foundational, I think, to what religion is. I mean, if the word religios, the Latin word legios, like a ligament, means reconnection. It's that reconnecting relationship with all that is and recognizing our small ways of seeing, our small ways, those ways of fear that keep us safe, but also keep us very small and keep us thinking about our lives in very small ways. Like, how can we broaden to see more of the holy, see more of who God is, see more of who we are called to be in the world right now, and the challenges we face right now. We're here on purpose right now. And so that's what I see is the shift. It's the shift back into love. It's relationship. There's tons of science happening now. I can't keep up with all the books. I don't know if you've been trying, but all the books that are connecting the relationality of plants, even of forests, that, the underground mycelial conversations that are happening, the way that, of course, animals have emotions. Mark Beckhoff's work and others, and the ways that we're understanding in our more scientific minds that everything really is interconnected, that all things are held under what we call Christ. It's also not anything new. I just feel like it's a time of return. It's a time of remembering, and it is creating something new together. Yeah.
Yeah, as you know, about 6 months ago, I took a part-time job with Pacific Rim Institute, and the rest of our title is for environmental stewardship. So my colleague James and I in Circlewood talked a lot about this, and before I took the job, we realized that no, there is a role for me there now to be the executive director and to carry the organization forward in some ways, to help heal the organization and others, and that's been going really well. But I was surprised yesterday. We work with the local tribes in the region, and the Tulalip tribe sent a film crew to do a film all day on Pacific Rim Institute, in part to feature the work that they helped to fund on the land. But part of that process was simply me lining up people who were in the PRI community to speak about the work. So at the board chair, I had one of the core volunteers, had one of the representatives of local tribes come and talk about the work. And for most of the day, I just followed the film crew and I got to listen to these things, to what people would say. And I think the board chair, his testimony, I'll call it, was the most surprising, because Pacific Rim is in great part a scientific organization. We take part in studies. We do research in order to help recover endangered species in terms of helping to restore damaged ecologies. That's the work. And so, we really value science and science education in particular. And this guy, Joe, is a scientist and was a professor and just knows everything there is to know about nature and especially about the land that PRI is on. Anyway, he was talking about the recovery of a flower called the golden paintbrush, which we helped to get off the endangered species list, and about the research that goes on. And I was really proud of all that he was saying. But then the filmmaker just, afterwards said, well, why do you do this work? Like, why are you here? And Joe just looked at the camera and he said, because of love. Like it was a no-brainer. It's like, it's all about love. We do this because what we call stewardship is just another name for love. How do we serve this place? How do we know enough about this place? How do we learn enough about this place so that we know its needs, so that we can shore up the ecologies, so that we can remove invasive species and sort of do our jobs as healers and caretakers of this place? And many people said that. They all brought up this love at the heart of everything, which just so surprised me. But it was wonderful. I thought, okay, I think I have a lot to learn from this place, which I just had not really been thinking up until that point. Yeah.
So important to talk about it. Like, it's something that we may value, but it's just not culturally sort of like invited. If you talk about something as, woo-woo as love, but it's there. And I think the more we talk about it, the more we are changing the language, which changes the way we see, which changes the worldviews.
We've been in conversation with Victoria Loorz, co-founder of the Wild Church movement and of the Center for Wild Spirituality. For more information about all of that, please go to this episode's show notes at earthkeepers.online. And as we always do, Earthkeepers is going to take a one-episode winter break, so be sure to check back in a few weeks for a new episode to start the new year. The Earthkeepers podcast is an expression of Circlewood, an organization committed to cultivating a more ecologically conscious faith. For more information about the podcast, or to learn about the ways you can support this work, go to our website at earthkeepers.online. You can contact us by leaving a voicemail through the podcast website, or by emailing us at earthkeepers@circlewood.online. I am Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. James Amidon is our executive producer. Our content editor and researcher is Colleen Meggerly, and our sound engineer is Dave Wolfers. Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director, and Forrest Reed is the composer of our original music. Thank you for listening, friends, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.